Can I borrow your cute bow?
Sure. If you start calling me everything tomorrow.
I'm not sure a cute bow would look the same on you, Jeff, as it does on me.
Give me a chance.
Can I say for the record, call me a peach?
Yeah.
So
Nice.
I don't think it was that. Yeah. I was like, hey, I think you're gonna help. You're welcome. I know, I didn't know the IT in here. Like, they've always come down and like, I can't connect my computer. Okay. I'm like, I think there's somebody else who can help. I'll talk to that. So, Murphy's Law, as soon as she showed it to me, it started working. I'm like, sweet.
Almost near the market, just this side of the market. Our story, like a green wall mill and melon.
Because that wasn't the initial part for that, right? Right. Further down the worksheets. Further. Yeah. Right. Which is short sleep.
Trying to pretend it's summer.
All right. I don't know. Just
Bump up the shoes too.
you're playing Thursday, so double up.
You got top players in time?
I don't know.
Because like they never do. And it's not even summer. I don't know what pretending it is.
Yeah,
Kevin, Shelly, Shelly were.
Chef, so that's why she was so awesome.
We needed her. We needed that right field.
So at 10, she said, she called me.
Oh shit.
The 5 minutes later, I think this picture of just this face.
All right, we have a quorum for the special council meeting. We'll begin. And the first item, of course, is the sidewalk infill policy. And who's presenting? Okay, very good. Very. Just come on forward.
Good afternoon. So I'm going to start by reading you a quote from the strategic plan. And that quote is, as Kitchener grows and concerns increase regarding the effect of air quality, climate change, traffic congestion, and shortages of fuel, residents are increasingly turning to other transportation options such as walking, cycling, and taking public transit. So what we'll walk through this afternoon is why we need sidewalk infill specifically, typical concerns that we deal with on a regular basis when we're looking at infilling these sidewalks, policy framework considerations, a draft priority ranking criteria that we've set up. It plays off of criteria that was set up way back in 2004, but we've changed it, we've modified it, made it better, we feel. And what we really want to get to is a couple of brainstorming sessions with you and why we're here today. The first one will be regarding process considerations, and the second being mitigation measures. And then finally, we'll get to a brief Q&A once we've gotten through all of that.
So what you're suggesting is that we hold off on questions until you've got through the entire package?
Yes, okay. Yes, exactly. Once we get through, while we're into the two brainstorming sessions, by all means, ask questions around those two topics specifically, and then we'll address any other additional questions at the end of the presentation. So sidewalks provide safe places for people to walk and is an essential responsibility of all government entities involved in constructing or regulating the construction of public rights of way. We're not really here to talk about where sidewalks go. In our opinion, sidewalks should go on both sides of every roadway, but rather we're here to figure out how best to incorporate those sidewalks. It's a basic principle that they'll be well-designed, safe places for people to walk along both sides of all public rights of way. So in terms of sidewalks and sidewalk safety specifically, in the past 5 years, there have been 245 related pedestrian collisions in the city of Kitchener alone. Of that, 7 collisions were a direct result of someone walking along the side of the roadway and being struck by a car, similar to the picture that you see there. And 11 collisions occurred as a pedestrian attempted to cross the roadway mid-block on a roadway without sidewalks. As an aside, there's also 2 liability cases within the region of Waterloo for these kind of conditions specifically.
So could you repeat that last point?
There's 2 ongoing liability suits for that type of condition. So why sidewalk infill? Well, firstly, there's been changes to legislation for accessibility for Ontario's with Disabilities Act, and that requires that communities facilitate all roadways to be accessible to all Ontarians. In 2006, 14.3%, 4.4 million Canadians, or 1 in 7, of Canada's population reported having some form of disability. And walking is the only mode of travel that is universally affordable and allows children, youth, and people with specific medical conditions to travel independently. And finally, there's a greater focus on sustainable communities as the City of Kitchener, provincial and federal policies try to limit the continuation of urban sprawl and move towards a more sustainable development. Additionally, the aging population. And with the aging population, as you're all aware, baby boomers are getting older, and we have a great number of the population that's growing older, and there's new legislation that's specifically targeting those drivers that are 80 plus. So every 5 years, they have to redo their testing, they have to have their eyesight tested, and that's causing people to look for alternative modes of transportation earlier than they had in the past. Additionally, if you look at that graph at the bottom, and it's hard to see on the screen there, but that's basically the average age of Canadians over the past 50 years, and you can see that that's a line that's steadily increasing. In terms of rail transit, the region of Waterloo is currently undergoing a paradigm shift in transportation services. There's less focus on the car, and there's more focus and a concentration on transit and active transportation uses, so walking and cycling. And in that sense, walkability is the key to the success of an efficient and effective public transportation system. As you can appreciate, if you choose to take transit, every trip begins and ends by you walking someplace. Walking and health. Walking really is the most ancient form of health and wellness that we have as a population. And the design and construction of a walkable community provides the most affordable transportation system any community can plan and maintain. Walkable communities put urban environments back on a scale for the sustainability of resources, both natural and economic, and lead to increased social interaction and physical fitness while diminishing crime and other social problem areas. This is anecdotally, individuals who walked an additional kilometer per day reduced their chances of becoming obese by 5%, compared to those who commute an extra hour per day, who are actually 6% more likely to be obese. So as you can see, there's that ancillary benefit when you're walking in terms of wellness and overall health care. And then there's walking as a form of commuting. In 2006, nearly 40,000 residents in the Kitchener Census metropolitan area, which basically is the region of Waterloo, traveled less than 5 kilometers on their commute. So if you look at 5 kilometers, that can easily be achieved by walking or cycling, and you don't necessarily need to take a car to make those commutes. Between 2001 and 2006, sustainable modes of transportation saw a notable rate of growth, and while walking stayed relatively the same, the use of public transportation, like I said, also requires that you walk beginning and end of every trip. So approximately 10% of all commutes at that point, or 23,000 trips a day, within the Waterloo region involve walking. As I go back, we actually anticipate this to increase in the future. With the development of the ION and legislation through the Places to Grow Act, as you can appreciate, as we urbanize, these rates should increase. And neighborhood turnover. So in terms of a neighborhood, there's always that generational turnover. And according to the National Association of Home Builders, the typical buyer of a single-family home can be expected to stay in that home approximately 13 years before they move out. So if you look at this bar graph here, it gives you an idea or a sense of the average length, the long-run average of home ownership. Near the end of that, you'll see the 2007, 2008 numbers are a little higher, and that can be attributed to the recession where people were less likely to spend money and buy a bigger home. Research by the National Association of Realtors indicates that millennials own fewer cars and drive less than their predecessors. They'd rather walk, bike, car share, and use public transportation and live in an area where that's all easily accessible. So as neighborhoods undergo that general transition that we're speaking of, the transportation needs change significantly. Now, to identify a millennial, that's probably not most of us in this room, but that's those that were born between 1980 and 2000. So those that are kind of entering the housing market right now as we speak. To give you a specific example, and we're all familiar with Glasgow Street. Glasgow Street was a street where we chose to limit sidewalk to one side of the roadway. And I received a call less than 2 weeks ago from a young lady that moved into the neighborhood in December. And she lives on the side of the roadway where there is no sidewalks, and she was up in arms, wanting to get involved in the process, wanting sidewalks on that side of the roadway because her young children needed that sidewalk to access Westmount Public School. So the typical concerns that we hear from the residents when we're looking at the installation of sidewalks, I'm going to run through those in a little bit more detail now. No one will use it. That's one that we typically hear. And while there might not be an immediate need for the sidewalk as a transportation facility and a connection, it still will ultimately be used for other purposes, be it recreational, general accessibility, and it increases overall pedestrian safety. Not to mention the accessibility to transit, should there be transit in the area. One other one that we commonly hear is no one with a disability lives in this neighborhood. And even if that's true at the time that we're having that conversation, what about visitors, the aging population, turnover in the neighborhood, or any of those other issues that we've previously spoken about? And the street is so quiet, the pedestrians can just walk on the road. Again, while some might feel safe walking on the roadway, sidewalks provide a safe environment for all users, and all users of age and ability. Additionally, when we're talking about sidewalks, especially in a Canadian climate such as ours, the wintry conditions pose a problem. The roadway becomes narrow, pushing you closer to traffic, and at the same time, roadways are upkept at a different level than sidewalks, so roadways tend to be quite a bit more slippery than sidewalks themselves, which actually makes it that much more dangerous. Trees, and the fact that trees may be cut down with any sidewalk infill proposal. And while sidewalks can be designed where possible to avoid trees, there's also materials and techniques that we can look at to mitigate those measures as well. And we're going to talk a little bit about mitigation a little bit later on. Sometimes trees may have to be removed to install sidewalks. But again, we'll look at mitigation measures and replacement programs that could potentially alleviate those concerns. Property value is commonly heard as well. And studies of trails and sidewalks throughout North America indicate that there's minimal to no impact on property values when you install sidewalks. And if you extrapolate that further, there's been studies that have also shown that neighborhoods, that are more walkable tend to have a higher property value than those of the same type of neighborhood that are less walkable. So it's quite possible and would likely be that if we install sidewalks and that neighborhood becomes more walkable as a whole, it will eventually drive up property values rather than deteriorate them. Impacts to front lawn and or parking. In most cases, it is municipal lands that are being used for the sidewalk. It's very, very rare, and I can't think of any offhand, where we actually have installed municipal sidewalk on private property. That being said, while many homeowners don't realize where the property line actually is, we can work with that homeowner to minimize those impacts, if at all possible. And again, that's one of the primary pieces that we'd like to look at through the mitigation brainstorming session a little later on. Tax dollars and where they should be spent. Sidewalks are really an integral part of the transportation network and a necessary cost. A reduction in vehicle trips as a result of sidewalks reduces the overall vehicle cost to your constituents and can also reduce those healthcare costs, as we stated earlier. By reducing the overall demand on the roadway, we can also drive down any reconstruction and widening issues that may occur as well. And finally, I will have to shovel snow. That's probably the biggest concern when we're talking about residents that don't have sidewalk, that could potentially have sidewalk through an infill program. And the most difficult part of snow removal is where snowplows deposit that packed snow and ice onto the sidewalk. And this can be reduced. This can be reduced through good street design. And it's also one of the primary reasons that curb-face sidewalks should really be used as a last resort. However, that being said, the more snow that there is on the roadway, the more danger it is, again, for pedestrians to share that roadway with traffic. And it increases the overall importance of sidewalks. So you can see how it's cyclical. Landscaping and the actual destruction of private landscaping that's been placed on municipal property. If that landscaping is in the public right-of-way, there is the ability to replant and transplant those materials with a sufficient setback from the sidewalk to minimize maintenance needs. And the landscaping should be designed to complement a sidewalk rather than act as a barrier for a safe place to walk. In terms of policy framework and the existing policies that are already in place at the City of Kitchener, we have the pedestrian charter, we have a plan for a healthy Kitchener, the strategic plan, the City of Kitchener Development Manual, Council Policy I-1120, which is basically sidewalk locations in new subdivisions, the Kitchener Transportation Master Plan, the Kitchener Transportation Demand Management Plan, and the City of Kitchener Official Plan. With all of these policies in play and all of them referencing sidewalk in one way or another, it creates a little bit of confusion, and there's a lack of clarity in terms of the policies and the criteria that govern sidewalk, and there's a disconnect between the mandate of those policies and how we actually do sidewalk infill, and how we do infill through an infill program and through reconstruction itself. So that's the problem that we're trying to solve. So in order to facilitate the reconstruction of sidewalk infill and address residential concerns, it's necessary to formalize that policy that I just spoke of and prioritize accordingly based on an assortment of factors. So key considerations in terms of a policy: how we prioritize those infill for sidewalks, how we deal with budget constraints, how we deal with residential input and residential notification. We know that that's a primary concern, and that's a concern that we definitely need to address. And where and when exemptions should be granted, if any, understanding that process as well. In terms of prioritization of sidewalk infill itself, proximity to schools, to transit, to major destinations should all be of paramount importance when we're looking at priority. Additionally, we should also be looking at roadway volume and relative overall pedestrian comfort. So as you can see here, and it's going to be more visible in your handout and on the screen in front of you rather than on the big screen, this is the draft priority ranking criteria. So we can touch base on this a little bit today, but really this is a piece that we'll bring back to you on a later date to have further discussion about and whether or not it makes sense. But it's to give you it's a piece of the pie, and it's to give you a little bit of an idea as to how we feel infill projects should be ranked and prioritized. And by all means, you can tell us if you think we're on track or completely off base there. So the first piece that we really want to get to today is the first brainstorming session, and that would be process considerations. So as I've stated earlier, there's no defined process for the infill of sidewalks, either through a prioritized ranking or through reconstruction. And because of this, there are a number of concerns that we've went through that are typically voiced, and we'd like to be able to identify the process and formalize a process. So what we're doing is we're tossing it out to you for your ideas, for your thoughts, and we want to incorporate as much as possible as we can from you into the process so that we're all working from the same page. So we'll turn it over to you.
Okay, we have a few comments. Councillor Fernandez.
Thanks, Barry. Can you just go back to the slide of typical concerns where it says no one will use it? Yeah. So just concerned about the comment. Additionally, in winter months, it is generally unsafe to walk on the roadways due to narrowed roadways and potentially icy surfaces. I guess I'm a little bit concerned because in a way you're saying that you're inferring that maybe we're not doing a good enough job of clearing our roadways, hence, we are creating, it's kind of a double-edged sword, right?
Right. Well, I'm not saying we're not doing a good enough job. You have to appreciate that you're not taking the same care. You're driving a truck to clear the roadway, whereas everything that's done on the sidewalk is typically hand cleared and then salted by hand, where the road is a very different scenario. But what we want to, and not to steer you in a different direction, but what we really want to talk about is how we address the process rather than the impact or the material that we've talked about to this point.
Yeah, I was just going to come to that. I think there may be some questions at the end on the overall,
Right.
but just going back. Yeah, okay, here, I guess.
So,
In terms of the process of dealing with this, I think there will be some very specific things that members of council will want to speak about.
right.
And get a clarification on that. So with that in mind, and working on the process right now, Councillor Fernandez, do you want to make some other comment on this, or shall I come back to you?
Come back to me, please.
Okay. Then on the process, Councillor Glenn Graham.
Thanks very much, Barry. So on process, in terms of looking at the consultation, I think a key thing is timing and having advanced notice as far as possible, having some kind of online presence where the project is available, and in addition to, of course, any kind of personal, interpersonal PIC, that kind of thing. The other thing is looking at projections for transit volume and development. So the density of development potential. For instance, if it's along what we would consider the spine of the LRT, that would obviously be much more dense in the future, even out towards Ottawa, that kind of thing. And I guess having input from the region about their transit projections, that kind of thing. Beyond that, I think the catchment area around it's not just the street, and we've talked about this before, it's the surrounding streets. So we have to figure out how far afield do we try and survey. And of course there's effort and cost, so we need to debate that. But I think that we have to look at going beyond the initial street, because a lot of streets are affected. Thanks.
Right.
Okay, this is, I think, the input session in terms of the questions that are on the screen right now. Deal with some of those things that Councillor Graham just spoke to. So at the next few minutes, if we can put forward some of our specific ideas, I think that would be helpful to formulate the next process.
Right. What I've done is I've pulled up a list of questions that we felt were applicable to this area. It's on the screen now. It wasn't in the initial handout that you received. And by no means is this kind of the be-all, end-all. We're completely open to whatever your thought process may be. But these are some of the lead-in questions that we thought may help you get to what we're trying to pull out of today's session.
All right. Councillor Etherington, speaking to the questions that are in front of us, Peter.
Yeah, I think these would fall into that category, Barry. On the meetings with residents, it's always seemed to me that we have those meetings too late in the process. Why is that? Why don't we have them earlier?
Well, through this process, and I agree, it's one of those things that we've pretty much already formalized the design when we take it to the residents, and that's partly why. It's easier to deal with the resident when you have a design, at least on paper, that you can show them. So some of the things that we've tossed around, and it's on the screen right now, is potentially meeting them earlier on in the process, giving them some sort of education material, even meeting them in their homes after hours and outlining in front of them visually where the potential sidewalk may go.
Right. Yeah. Well, the example of the one on our agenda, the Kennedy Palmer one, is a good example of that. There's all kinds of positives happening now, like when we're right down to the crunch. And there were the earlier meetings, but very little in way of proactive. It's always reactive, and then your guys get involved and they do a really good job. But it always comes late. The other problem, the other suggestion I always make, and it's the same suggestion, why not get out in front of those situations where we know there are going to be concerns and get those positives well ahead of before we get to a situation like we're in at Kennedy Palmer.
Yeah, it's very clear in the initial stages of what we're going through now is that from a process perspective, we need to get out there and involved with the residents earlier rather than later, earlier than we're doing right now.
Because I'm always impressed that you guys have the solutions, but they're never mentioned until people are screaming their lungs out. So it's just a comment.
Okay, so the key takeaway there is
Earlier on in the process.
Councillor Galloway-Seelock?
Yeah, I agree with the last comments with regards to earlier engagement. I think one of the, I kind of came out of the first bullet point when I was looking at those questions. I'm wondering if there could be a separate section in the capital budget where it specifically outlines the road reconstructions that do have sidewalk infill, so that it's within our 10-year capital forecast, where councillors can be aware of when it's coming up and kind of have that there, so that it doesn't kind of come as a surprise, but clearly have it identified as road reconstructions with sidewalk infill. And then it allows either the ward councillor to get out in front of it, or also for staff to get to that process earlier if it's in the capital budget and identified that way. And then with the last bullet point there with who should be circulated, I agree with that. It should be the affected residents on the streets where the infill will happen. And I think it's also important that our advisory committees and neighborhood associations that are affected by the sidewalk infill be notified on an annual basis. So I think the relevant advisory committees, it could be cycling, GRAC, whatever ones kind of are affected, but give them a list of what annually will happen, and try and do that even before or during kind of the capital budget. So get out in front of it again. As for public engagement, I think it's going to have to be a combination of both, where you have that overall meeting, because a lot of people, residents, like the numbers of being able to go somewhere with their neighbors and being able to talk out and might not have the courage to ask the questions on their own, but to be able to hear from the group, but also being flexible enough that if there is someone that you need to go and have more detailed discussions with, being able to make those after hours meetings and going and meeting with them. And then potentially even making the sidewalk, the markings on the sidewalk on site. But I think that's a, kind of a as needed basis. I don't want to do too much, because it could just keep rubbing it in their face if they're not excited about it, or some of them are and some of them aren't. So I think it's kind of going to be on a scenario, each scenario basis. So that's my thoughts on this one.
So don't overdo it.
I don't think so, no.
To be clear, before we take another question, one of the things that I think has come up kind of indirectly is the thought process of a survey. And to be completely open and honest, we as a staff feel that we probably shouldn't get into that type of survey for the directly affected residents in this type of scenario for sidewalk infill, primarily because when you look at sidewalk, yes, we understand that at this point, most residents that are directly impacted typically don't support a sidewalk. We realize that. But sidewalks are a tool for the entire neighborhood. So a survey of the directly affected residents isn't necessarily reflective of what the neighborhood or the neighborhood association may feel.
One of the practical things that Councillor Galloway-Seelock came up with there, and I look to Mr. Chapman for this, that I know we have a number of codes on our current 10-year capital forecast, but perhaps one additional one could be there that would highlight those where there is an infill on the projects.
Which is a very good idea.
Yeah. Councillor Gazot.
We're just dealing here with infills. We're not talking about, there's no question on new development.
No, this is
No.
infill.
Okay, so
It's just infill. New development is structured such that sidewalk goes in on both sides of every roadway.
yeah, that's fine. Do we have any idea of how many projects we're dealing with on infills?
Yeah, there's approximately 1,600 kilometers of roadway, give or take, in the city. There's 400 kilometers of missing sidewalk. With today's current budgeting system that we have, that would take us probably 150 years to install it all. We do about 1.5 kilometers to 2.5 kilometers a year.
That's good. Good news. That 400 kilometers, that covers cul-de-sacs.
That covers everything, yes. So, and when we talk about prioritization, those are the types of streets that would be of the lowest priority.
Do we have, of those 400 kilometers, do we know, are they 400 kilometers where there's no sidewalk on either side of the road? Do we know what that is?
Not offhand. It's obviously exponentially less than that. It's not, most of that 400 kilometers has sidewalk on one side, but when we're talking about a lot of the industrial areas, the Huron Road business parks and that sort of thing, those are all roadways that don't have sidewalk on either side.
Okay, I'm concerned about what impact does the neighborhood have? Because in most cases where we have this issue, most of the people do not want sidewalks. They've lived there for many years, they've lived safely there, and they've never had sidewalks, and they question the need for sidewalks. So this Kennedy Palmer, we were over there the other day. It's a good example. People, what strength? Who trumps whom here on this issue?
Well, in my opinion, sidewalks, again, they're a neighborhood tool as opposed to a residential tool, a directly affected residential tool.
But
and
what
at
do
the
you
same
call
time,
a neighborhood? What's the neighborhood?
Loosely defined, I mean, I would say anywhere within a walking distance, which is usually a 400-meter radius.
Okay.
That being said, we're not just talking about the residents that exist there today, but the residents that could, as it happened in Glasgow, the residents that could be there tomorrow, or a year from now, or 5 years from now.
But we're primarily concerned with the residents that are there today. I mean,
But I think that the point that was made earlier on was it is beyond the specific property owners
Right.
that where the sidewalk would go. I think that's the differentiator, I guess, whether you believe it or not. That's the differentiator.
Well, my main concern here is who is the neighborhood and who trumps whom.
Okay, I think Justin would like to.
The other challenge we have is transit users are walking at the beginning of their trip, which is likely in their neighborhood, and as well as at the end of their trip, which could be somebody else's neighborhood, to get to their place of employment, school, other programs and services we offer in the city. So the catchment area is very hard to define because it could be somebody on the other side of the city that's affected by a sidewalk decision in another neighborhood.
All right, I don't. Is it fair to say that our staff has pretty much made up their mind on where this goes?
I wouldn't say we've made up our mind. We, though, feel that sidewalks are a neighborhood tool that are to be used by all users and shouldn't necessarily be left for the decision of those that are directly affected.
Do we have any idea of how much our sidewalks are used? Do we have any concept whatsoever on that whole issue?
Mr. Reagan?
We can do pedestrian counts where sidewalks exist, but some areas people will not walk on the area because they feel like they're walking on somebody's private property. There may be accessibility issues with walking along somebody's front lawn if you're using a wheelchair. So I guess if we plan for an understanding of not knowing how much sidewalks are used, we're asking for them in all new developments. Most municipalities ask for sidewalks on both sides of the street in all street cases. Most municipalities have a similar challenge that we do in terms of having to infill street segments that were planned in the 50s when a lot of auto-oriented planning was happening where sidewalk linkages didn't go through. So it's a difficult one to answer because we can't survey things that aren't in place necessarily.
I would like to know the answers, and I walk a lot and bicycle a lot and see a lot. I would like to know that answer. I'm not talking about where there are no sidewalks. Just give me some kind of indication of where there are sidewalks, how much are they used?
If we go back to an earlier slide, and again, I don't want to just talk about, we want to talk more about the process and what we can do to improve the process. But if we go back to the earlier slide that talks about commuting, we talked about 23,000 trips a day in Waterloo region that involved walking.
Well,
So-
I sort of question some of your examples. I mean, if I take my car, I have to walk to my car, so you could have thrown me in on the
Yeah,
walking.
those numbers that I'm giving you are only related to walking trips and transit-related trips.
Well, okay, my biggest concern with this whole issue is what rights do the people, and I'm looking at the neighborhood. To me, the current neighborhood, I can't be as concerned for the neighborhood 20 years down the road. 20 years is a long time, even when you're young.
So if you, Councillor Gazzola, if you can, what we're looking for here right now is the input in answering those questions. So are you saying that in the bottom third of this screen that should be circulated and be relying only on the affected residents being defined by the property owners?
I don't have a problem with circulating wider rather than narrower. Circulate, but some area has to have more impact and should have more, should be able to trump somewhere else. I mean, if you talk theoretically, no one can ever argue about sidewalks. There's so many, when you're just talking, but we have to be practical also. So I have no problem with the process, but my concern is at the end, how do we weigh the process and on what basis do we make decisions?
I think a lot of your concerns, pardon the pun, but can be mitigated through the next kind of brainstorming piece that we're going to do, the second piece, which is around mitigation measures. The idea of the mitigation measures in the brainstorming session there is a recognition that those directly affected residents do carry weight. And what we're trying to do through the mitigation piece that we'll discuss in a little bit is to identify ways to make it more amenable to them to be able to install these sidewalks.
Okay,
Okay,
I'm
well,
going to go to Justin to answer further, and then I'll come back to you if you have more questions because the 5
I just
minutes
have
is
a
up.
little short one. Can I? Okay, go ahead.
Mr. Reed?
Through the chair, the ranking criteria helps us prioritize the sidewalks that are most in need based on pedestrian generator activities in the area, so that helps us prioritize the streets to target first. So as Barry mentioned earlier, if we use our current budget allocation, we're looking at 150 years worth of sidewalk infill, so the ones that are least priority would be at the later end of that. So that should help clarify in some term about who's going to be using the sidewalks and those ones being prioritized first.
Okay. Councillor Fernandez.
Thank you. So I'll go to a couple of things that have already been said, which was better communication to the public and giving areas under consideration a heads up now. So I think the idea of identifying them in the budget is a great idea. Also, I think we need to look at the present connectivity. So if there's already a sidewalk on one side of the street and it connects to adjoining and abutting sidewalks and allows for connectivity at least on a minimum of one side, I think that we should be looking at that as a criteria, whether to infill or not. But that speaks to the question of us, and I think, Barry, you said you weren't sure what streets of those 400 kilometers were missing sidewalk, if any of those or how many of those had a sidewalk at least on one side. So can we break that out at some point in time? Is that possible?
Yeah, that's we can do that. We can break it out.
Okay. And just your comment about the shared roadways and decisions being made, I guess I look at it a little bit like when we do the traffic calming public discussions, right? Often there's a discussion, should we allow just the people on the street affected? Should we allow the neighborhood that's affected? Because like roadways, sidewalks are used by, especially if there's people walking to a transit stop or a plaza or to a school, they're used from all over the area, right? So I think there's a similarity there in how we should be taking into consideration not just the people that live on the street, but the people that in a way that's surrounded. I think you had already said you agreed with that. I agree we should be looking at each project individually, and that sort of goes back to the whole idea of if there's a sidewalk on one side and connectivity. And I think Mr. Reedman said that we could do a foot traffic study similar to how we do our road studies with the tubing. Of course, then you run the risk of kids jumping up and down on the tube,
or people walking over the.
Yeah.
or jumping over top of it. Yeah, if they don't want a sidewalk. But I think there are various ways we can solve that problem. So those were kind of my key points about where I see that we need to add on to our process.
Not to steer any further any further comments and questions, but the one thing that we haven't heard about yet from anyone in terms of process is when you, as council, would like to see any sort of approval process come back. So whether or not this comes back as on an annual basis, and we list all of the projects up front, and you get it similar to the way we do the traffic calming in January, February, whether we bring individual projects back, that sort of thing, so that we have a clear idea of what you would like to see from us moving forward.
And
Okay.
I wasn't quite finished. Just one little. That was part of my statement with the better communication was give the areas under consideration a heads up now, which was exactly what you just spoke to. We have a list of all the streets that are going to be traffic calmed, where they are on the priority list, and I think the sidewalks should be the same thing.
Okay, so I'm conscious of the time. We're trying to get through another set of questions and discussion here. Maybe we'll pick up some more. So we've got 3 speakers. So if yours is the same issue that has already been dealt with and suggested, then perhaps you could skip over it, speak to any of the other issues, and particularly the one that was just talked about. When do we want council to be involved? Councillor Yanetsky. New issues, if you can.
My main question was going to be the council process that you just touched on now, and I was just wondering how that was going to take place, because it comes back to the issue of Glasgow Street last year when we went through the reconstruction process, and there was a variety of issues from traffic calming to bike lanes and all that stuff. Of course, the sidewalk was one of the main issues. And once we resolved everything except the sidewalk, it didn't come back here. I had to get the residents to come as a delegation because staff was not going to bring forward any report. So that's what I was concerned, is how we will have an input. And if we can provide that input on an annual basis during the budget time or something of that nature, I think that's what has to be done, because the buck stops with us. And we have to make that decision somehow, as opposed to giving staff a carte blanche openness to go ahead and start putting in sidewalks where they think is all best based on a criteria rating, and just go full steam ahead. So it has to come back to council one way or the other on an annual basis is probably fine, and then take it from there as to how many sidewalks we're going to be looking at. The criteria that you had just shown there before, ranking closeness.
That's a little later on. This is process.
Is that later on in the process? Okay. All right. I'll bring that question later. I was concerned about the council. Are we talking also of this being also considered with industrial land and regional roads, or is that totally separate?
Regional roads are a separate issue, but yes, city roads, like municipal roadways that are industrial, will fall in this policy as well.
So they will be considered. Regional roads won't be considered.
Right.
Okay.
But industrial roadways will.
Okay, because there are issues there with a lot of industrial areas without
any sidewalk at all. Yeah.
But they're not residential in terms of how the industries will look at. That's a totally different perspective. But I just don't know whether they would be included as well. I guess I can comment on a couple other questions, but then they'll probably fall into the next session then.
Okay. Councillor Glenn Graham.
Thanks for your indulgence. I'll just go over a couple points because this wasn't up when I spoke. So we have to ensure that we don't have approval before we engage the residents. We need to make sure that while their approval isn't required, we have to have at least an openness to engage them. I think to manage expectations, though, we should have some kind of one-pager that should talk about the fact that like you've positioned with us, formal approval is not required. Here are the benefits. Here are the, the issues that we can talk about. And I think that's good to set the table for residents so they understand the framework. And the other thing is, in terms of, I wasn't recommending a survey, but I do think that we have to figure out how far afield to ask this. The other issue that Councillor Galloway-Selak was talking about was the issue of engagement in that area. And I think on site, based on my experience, where you're actually on the road or the sidewalk area, is much more valuable rather than a kitchen table. You can point to things, you see the traffic, you see examples of people where they're walking, you see parked cars and where people are walking out. I think that's critical. And so I think that, the other aspect is if we can do some kind of poster, even on telephone poles, some kind of indication of what's coming. I don't know how, just might be another channel to consider because people might not get it otherwise, and people walking back and forth for a bus could be, potentially engaged that way.
Councillor Ioannidis.
Thank you for your presentation. I thought your typical questions are pretty well bang on what we can expect from residents. I think the bottom line here is no residents want to have a sidewalk. Let's face it, they don't want to shovel anything extra than what they have to. So my point is, and I think the last few sidewalk issues that have come to us is, how do we take this out of our hands and leave it on a staff level? Because I think, personally, either we believe in these principles of having a pedestrian charter and all the other stuff that's stipulated with that, then we should allow you to do your job and take the politics out of this. Because that's what I want to know. Because why are we going to be dealing with this issue on every little issue when we have a few residents that are upset about having a sidewalk? Because the bottom line is they don't want to shovel it. And that's regardless. Our job here is to look at the future and look at how the neighborhood's going to be in 20 years from now, not what it is today. So that's what I want.
Okay, those are the only speakers I have on this. Let's go to the second brainstorming session.
So the second brainstorming section that we're talking about is mitigation measures. So we recognize that the infill of sidewalk is not desired by most residents that are impacted. And so what we want to do is make it more acceptable to those residents. And there's a whole gamut of mitigation measures that be considered. But what we want to know is if there really are measures that you've heard of or that you want us to consider, or any sort of anything around that in terms of mitigation.
Okay, comments on the questions that are in front of us right now? Seeing none? I know. I realized that. My screen was blank, that was all. Okay, we do have a couple of comments now. Yes, it would have been good. Councillor Glenn Graham.
Just talking about hydro poles, and I think that's something that we need to look at, whether we relocate them or not and whether we can go around them. That's often a barrier, and it's a reason given as to why we need to put a sidewalk on one side or another, and the width of the sidewalk. So I think we need to understand what's possible around those, like a tree. But we don't always have to spend a boatload more to relocate them. But I think it's important to understand the options around that.
Councillor Yanetsky.
I'm just trying to determine that in the presentation you had the priority ranking criteria, and you've got factors in terms of destinations, schools, distances, and all that stuff. And I'm just wondering, in terms of what you got on the screen there, maybe dollars got to be involved in this too. In terms of one street you can go do straightforward, it could be no issues at all. And other ones, you got hydro poles got to be removed, trees are in the way, you got grading issues or whatever, that all of a sudden could add to the cost. So those are factors I think that should have a play in it. But in terms of looking at the priority ranking criteria, you've got broken down into 5 categories, 25 per each category almost, and then 10, 15. what is the dividing line to determine whether you build a sidewalk or you don't build a sidewalk? I mean, you've got the criteria as to what you consider, but do you have to get so many points, or even the lowest point will still get a sidewalk?
Yeah, again, we're not going to focus too much on the priority ranking criteria, but to answer your question, the intent is that in the future, in the fullness of time, that every street in the city of Kitchener, with very few minor exceptions, would have sidewalks on both sides of the roadway to make all streets as walkable as possible. That would certainly be staff's vision. Obviously, that won't come to fruition for 100, 150 years, but that would be the ultimate vision.
So basically, when you probably look at a whole list of sidewalks that need to be considered, or streets, I should say, that need sidewalks, do the priority ranking, and then take the ones that are the highest ranking ones, and go for them first.
Just work downwards.
And work your way down. Okay.
Okay. Councillor Etherington.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, on the issue of trees, particularly with the case we're looking at on Kennedy, it's fine to say you'll replace trees, but you're often talking about quite mature trees being replaced by tiny trees. And even as at Kennedy, if there's the offer to put in larger trees, then the risk to those larger trees, everyone knows, is substantially higher than the risk to smaller transplants. So I don't know what to suggest there, but that business of suggesting that additional tree plantings, I can understand why that would not appeal to many of the residents objecting to sidewalks. The other thing, in answer to Councillor Ioannidis, I kind of object to that fact that on Kennedy we have 42 of 44 residents who are against, and it has nothing to do with shoveling sidewalks. I don't know if there's any answer to the tree question, but obviously trees, mature trees, are absolutely vital to any city.
Mr. Reedman.
Through the chair, there are different techniques that we could use to mitigate some of those impacts. So rubberized sidewalks or asphalt segments of sidewalks around trees don't require as deep of a depth to go into the root system. So there may be opportunities in certain cases where we could work around a large mature tree. In terms of one of the mitigation measures where a larger tree may get cut down, would be to give residents a list of approved tree types so they could choose a new tree based on like what forestry would approve for types of trees for the front of your property. So it gives you a bit more choice in seeing what type of tree grows at your house over the future. So it may obtain some buy-in through that measure.
Another option that we're willing to explore moving forward, especially when we start talking about sustainable transportation, is a general repurposing of certain roadways to potentially save trees, narrow the carriageway, potentially lose parking or on one side to potentially save trees. There's a number of avenues that we can look at that we haven't really focused on in the past.
Next question, Councillor Gazzola, or comment further.
Yeah, I have a comment and a question. I want to first comment on Councillor Ioannidis' comments too. I find that a little questionable that nobody wants sidewalks because they have to plow them, they have to clean them. That's totally ridiculous. It's especially important when people are moving into areas with young families. They're always going to want sidewalks. When I moved into where I moved, in those olden days, you had to have a local improvement passed by the majority in the neighborhood in order to get sidewalks. So people want sidewalks for a lot of reasons, and I have no problem, again, going back to new areas. It's where we're already built up. Looking at this mitigation, the mitigation measures are all fine, and have you considered mitigation factors if there should ever be some cases where we don't go ahead and put in sidewalks? So can we look at those other side of mitigations?
It's an interesting point. It hasn't been something I've spent a lot of time at looking into, but it's something we can definitely look at.
Councillor Gazzo, if you can just press your button again, because I'm not quite sure I understood. Mitigation of, if you don't have, what things can be put into place if you do not have sidewalks on both sides. Is that correct?
Well, no, I see here it's a one-way street. We've made up our minds, now we're looking for mitigations if we do want to give in to what the neighborhood want. But is it possible to have mitigating things? Is it possible to have, and this to me really affects more than anything else, streets where there's only one, where there are no sidewalks whatsoever. There's sidewalks on one side. Or even if there are no sidewalks, maybe a mitigating factor is putting in sidewalks on one side and not putting them in on both sides.
Okay, so your comment is about where there are no sidewalks, basically, not where there is one, and question being...
Well, even if there is one, I'd like to know if there are problems. Are there speeding problems? Are there traffic problems? You know?
Okay. Councillor Fernandez.
Thanks. Of course, education is always crucial, I think, and so you've really hit that nail on the head right away. Information pamphlets, I think, there's an easy solution, even though we may be going away from paper billing. Is as long as we have that opportunity in people's tax bills, it's such a great opportunity to get that information in their tax bills. They open it, they read it. It really is helpful. The picture that you provided here, I was curious to know about what you were trying to show us. I think this is what you're trying to show us, is that what happened with the cracked sidewalk that you replaced is you've replaced it with a different, that's it, thank you, with different material to get around the tree. Is this?
Yeah, so this is an example of a rubberized sidewalk. So
yeah.
On the left is actually, it looks like it's an asphalt sidewalk, but essentially tree roots will cause heaving and cracking of concrete and asphalt sidewalks, whereas rubberized materials are more flexible and they don't do that. So as Justin said, it's when we're dealing with mature trees, it's just a potential mitigation measure. It's not that it would be the best solution in every case, but it's something that we can investigate on an individual basis that may allow us to save a number of trees if we were to look at installing a sidewalk.
Okay, so just a question about this kind of material or the way we would be using something like this. We would still maintain the same width of the sidewalk that was originally there, so it would stay within the 1.2, 1.3?
1.5. Yes, theoretically we would maintain that same width. There obviously may be extenuating circumstances, and it's another mitigation measure where you could potentially reduce the sidewalk to a substandard width to be able to further accommodate whatever it is that we're trying to accommodate at the time.
Yeah, and that was actually what I was going to ask you. So let's say, for example, if there were extenuating circumstances, you could actually not use the 3 panels on the left-hand side and still have a walkable sidewalk on the right-hand side. Closest to the tree. Sorry, I got my left and right mixed up here.
Right.
Yeah. Just a quick point. Somebody pointed out to me today that just recently, actually within the last day, I don't know if it was TD Green, but they put a value on a tree, not even an absolute mature tree, at $700. Just a value that we were talking about the EAB and the value of trees. Narrow roadways, I think you were mentioning something about that, and I know that that's something that you guys have been looking at with Pioneer Drive. Is that a mitigation factor you're thinking of instead of sidewalks or in addition to?
In terms of narrowing a roadway, we would typically use that general repurposing or narrowing of a roadway to be able to facilitate the installation of sidewalk. So if you narrow a roadway curb to curb, theoretically you've picked property up on one side or the other that you'd then be able to install a sidewalk with minimally impacting the homeowner itself, strictly from a land perspective.
Okay, so if we were to do that, how would that impact our cycling strategy? Like, if you're narrowing a roadway, you're going to have possibly more conflicts with
Right.
car and cycle.
We'd have to take a holistic look at whatever roadway it was at the time. It would be an individual assessment at that time.
Mr. Eden?
I was just going to repeat what Barry said. We'd have to look at it on a case-by-case basis to see what other demands there are, whether there's on-street parking or other things that are needed along the roadway.
Okay. And my one last mitigation suggestion would be if we look at combining sidewalk cycling, so we do more multi-use trails. And I understand that some people feel really uncomfortable with that possible conflict, but I see it a lot when I travel on my bike down Blair Road. That's a walking, cycling trail. It's just, I guess, an adjustment for people who are using that multi-use trail. And in Huron Road, of course, we've got students walking and people cycling. Could we be looking at some of that as alternatives on maybe, certainly not on our minor roads, but on our major roads?
Yeah, it would definitely be an alternative on roads, usually major collector and above, or roads that have been identified in the cycling master plan that may be able to accommodate both. For sure, it's something we can definitely look at.
Okay, we're getting off into trails, which is not, this is about sidewalks.
No, it's just about combining the two.
Yeah, I realize. But that's going to come up next week on the 23rd.
Mr. Reedman has a comment.
Mr. Reedman?
I would just like to cautious about like a carte blanche use of multi-use trails, because if there's a lot of driveway accesses, it creates a conflict with cyclists traveling in both directions at higher speeds than pedestrians that can create a safety concern across driveway accesses.
That's a good point too. Thank you.
Councillor Galloway, Sealot.
Yeah, getting back to the questions, I actually want to mention something from the process. You don't have to go back to the slide, but I think one of the ways that we can continue to engage residents, it would be outside the areas, to use social media to inform the community of where the sidewalk infills are going to happen at the appropriate time within the community engagement process for that specific street. And then moving to education, I think the pamphlet's a great idea, and that we should probably put a link to that on our website, or have a link on our website to the sidewalk infill, the purposes and solutions and typical concerns, as well as adding in there the pedestrian charter, and not too much information on it, but a link where if people want to do more research to find out about our pedestrian charter, that they can find the information more accessible to them. With the questions with regards to the trees, I just simply say yes to the first 4 bullet points. One of my questions was going to be with regards to narrowing of the sidewalks in areas where it makes sense, and you've already answered that would be one of the potential mitigation measures. And parking, I see the parking and the road redesign, they should go hand in hand, really. So I see, any concerns, whether it needs to have no parking on the street, or need to have like bays for parking or whatever. I see that all going hand in hand with the road redesign, as well as looking at it as a measure for sidewalks as well.
One last comment, Councillor Gazzola, and I'll make some comments and we'll move on to next steps.
I want to ask, and I don't want it to be taken as a frivolous question, but would we ever consider charging people for sidewalks on their frontage? When you consider, I had to pay for my sidewalk in my local improvement.
Having difficulty hearing you.
I'm sorry, my question was, would we ever consider charging people for sidewalks on their frontage?
And
because people that buy into a new development are paying for that in their...
So through the site plan process, through the development process, when you develop a property that doesn't currently have sidewalks on municipal frontage in the city of Kitchener, you are charged a reflective amount for that. So yes, we do charge those. We do charge for those sidewalks, and we do have an account set up in engineering with those funds.
You charge who?
The developers, whomever may be developing that
No,
property.
but what happens when you're doing an infill? It may not be a development. You're not charging.
Right, and in those
you're
instances,
not charging the homeowners.
No. We're not charging the homeowners. We only take the money, again, like I said, when we do those development processes.
Okay, I'll just quickly make a general comment on this. I think in a theoretical world, what Councillor Ioannidis would put forward would be ideal, and I think you either believe in it or you don't. And but as we know, there's always gray, not just black and white. And so whether or not we would have a policy that would say that it is strictly a staff position, would or not, would mean that at some point in time it would make its way back into the chamber. So I think the kind of promotion and education is important, and the early consultation and applying as many of the mitigating factors as possible. I think probably you'll start to see fewer and fewer objections to the sidewalks going in than we have seen on the rebuilds of the streets. So I would think the sooner we put some of these measures into place, more life will be easier around the horseshoe, and for you folks. So let's go to your last slide.
So in terms of where we'll go now and our next steps, we anticipate rolling something very similar out to the public and stakeholders in mid-September. We'll conduct an online survey. Again, we'll host this type of brainstorming session. To give you an idea, a typical brainstorming session isn't exactly what we're doing now. You sit around a table, you toss out ideas, and that's what we envision with the public and with those stakeholders. Once we've done that, we'll take all that information, we'll take what we've gathered here today, and we'll formalize a draft policy, and we'll have that about October, in and around that timeline. And we'll circulate that with the interested parties and the working groups that we've been working with on this project. And then from there, we'll report to committee and council back in January 2015.
Councillor Gazzola? Let's go back to that slide.
Yeah, I have no comments. I think the process is fine. How difficult would it be to list those 400 kilometers of streets that don't have sidewalks on both sides? I mean, these are the people, perhaps, that might be more interested in having a voice in this whole discussion. Is that a difficult... so it's there. It could be digitally put on our website?
Well, this is based on the draft ranking, so that we could get an idea of where streets fell. But yeah, there's, maybe 75 to 100 pages of streets here.
You're prepared to
street
share
sections.
That? With our open government now, we'll be sharing that, right?
See who's... Oh, I was going to say Chief Beckett isn't here, but it's the position. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I will put both of you on. You can decide who goes first. There you go.
Through you, Mayor Zaire. I want to thank the input that we're getting today. I've lost my train of thought now that we went through that little thing. What was the last point that we just made? I apologize.
The entire list.
Yes. Thank you. The list, as mentioned, is going to take a significant amount of time to get through. There might be some thought in, before we do that public meeting, I'm not sure we're going to be at the point where we'll be able to establish all these priorities of locations. My point is we might have a resident come and see that they have no sidewalks on the road, but it might not be earmarked for infill for 50 years. There might be some merit, and we've already discussed this to a degree, is on an annual basis, is that we establish our locations for that next year. We do public outreach at that point, advise all the residents on those streets that they're planned for sidewalk infill the next year, and then we can get input from the residents at that point. Just a thought out loud, but if we try to establish our priorities for the 400 kilometers that Barry mentioned, it's not going to be accurate to begin with. It's going to change over time. I think it's better if we do this on a case or year-by-year basis.
Okay. Justin? Okay. We have now three people, again, Councillor Ioannidis, Janetsky, and Gazzola. Is that correct? Okay.
Just wanted to make one little clarification before what I meant by saying depoliticizing this, I'm fully aware of that there's going to be some gray areas and all that stuff. But what I really wanted to emphasize is I think it needs to be tighter on what comes to us, and not just a few residents that are not happy about a certain situation and then it just comes to us and deal with us. We need to be a little more efficient with our time. We're here to make policies, which is what we're kind of doing right now. So I just would like to see it a little bit tighter. I think the mitigation, I think by all means, I think those processes should be in there, and I think they're great. So I think overall, yes, this is good. And again, I want to clarify that not all residents want sidewalks. No, I think residents want sidewalks, but I think residents that don't have a sidewalk currently are the ones that say they don't want a sidewalk because of those types of comments.
Okay. Councillor Yunetsky.
Thank you. In this whole process of coming back to us with through these different steps, I'm just wondering whether your objective is to have some type of list eventually once we go through this thing to already be looking at it for next year and be included in the budget process, or because the budget process next year will be a little later than we normally do because of the elections this year, and by the time we start it'll be just before Christmas, and approve the budget a little later than January as we did our first term. Is that where you're aiming at, or just doing the whole policy without any list for consideration for implementation for 2015?
So we have a draft list. We have the priority ranking, that draft, so we can run numbers and prioritize streets based on the draft criteria that we have set. So when we come back to you in January, we'll be coming back to you with formal policy, with the idea that that policy will then be able to dictate what streets we can come back to you with and recommend for installation for 2015. So we would anticipate having a program for 2015 and it being prioritized based on the new policy.
Okay, appreciate that. I just want to also comment on that last, when Councillor Fernandez was talking about that sidewalk, which is all crumpled up by the tree, roots growing. I think that was not the right slide to show, only because this is more of a repair of an existing sidewalk due to tree root growth, as opposed to we're talking about new sidewalks being put in on streets. That's just more of a repair, and we've done several of those as needed because all of a sudden of the seriousness of the situation. I know we did one on Belmont Avenue because I had the same problem, and it was a winter with pylons because it was just too slippery to walk around. So that got repaired, but it was not a new sidewalk.
But whether it's infill or a repair, it's just put there to make the point that there is a way to get around a tree.
Oh, that's right. I agree. Yeah.
Councillor Gazzola.
I'm going to ask again if it's possible to get that list. We have the information. Can we not throw a PDF file on our website? And if people want it, it's there. If they don't want it, they don't have to look at it.
Mr. Redmond.
Through the chair, we can provide a list. I would recommend us taking out the ranking until we've finalized the ranking criteria that's approved by council. But we can put on a list if that satisfies members.
I imagine you can do that fairly easily, so let's do that. The only other point I have is, are you cutting yourself short here by trying to get back to us in January of next year, which is also busy with so many budget issues and whatnot? Should you right now be saying, well, let's move this off a little bit? I'm looking for your consideration. It doesn't matter to me.
Through the chair, we have to do some public consultation before we report back to council and committee, and we would like to not do that during the summertime when people aren't necessarily as engaged in public meetings. And another consideration is we don't want to bind council with a policy that's not necessarily approved by that council. So if we approve something at the last minute and then a new council comes in, we'd like an opportunity for that council to have some say in that policy. So.
You pressed your microphone off.
No, but I thought I was giving you more time, and I thought you would grasp that. Wouldn't it make more sense to come back to us in February or March?
Ken?
Through you, Mayor Zaire, I think as Justin and I advised, with the election coming up in summertime, there's some timings we have to avoid, but I think we're confident that we could come back to you folks with the policy in January that would still allow us, once we have the policy in place, it would be very easy for us to establish our prioritized locations for that 2015 year. So we have a report coming up immediately after the policy being approved to us to recommend the 2015 locations. As long as we get that in place before, let's say, April when the construction season starts, I think we have time. Without that, and I appreciate the time challenges are going to be there with all the other things going on, but without that, then we're going to be going blind again in 2015 without any clear direction on where to infill sidewalks, or we put it off for another year. That's the options available to us.
Councillor Etherington.
Just one quick comment, Mr. Chair. We seem to have a design issue with our sidewalks, some of our sidewalks. As late as this morning, I had a call from a guy who walks extensively on Cortland between Carwood and Cedar. And he says with some of our new sidewalks, and I've also seen this problem in Victoria Park, with some of our new sidewalks, they slope dramatically to the road. So they're very difficult to walk on the slope, and particularly difficult for people with walkers and wheelchairs, or people pushing strollers. And I think this has to do with curbside sidewalks where there's no boulevard. Instead of the sidewalk being flat, it tips from the end of a driveway toward the road. And I just wanted to mention
that's a design issue. It's an important one. I think that it's not related to this, so if I could ask staff to respond to that question to all of council, but we should move on. Councillor Singh?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. And a quick comment, and I haven't said too much so far because I think this is a fairly appropriate direction to go with, and I have to compliment staff on a balanced approach. I think it takes into account the sensitivity, of course, of the inbuilt neighborhoods of that resident feedback, as well as trying to stay true to the current policy and the pedestrian charter already as it is. And a quick comment to earlier suggestion about having that list available and being a public document. I think there's some wisdom in that, especially the fact that a lot of times residents get caught off guard. They feel the decision process is too quick and too rapid for them to really respond back with feedback or engage their counselor or staff. When that information and that list is available well in advance, there's no, sometimes residents will have to take some responsibility on their own accord, having the information made available if they have exception to the direction that we're going. And so I think that would be appropriate. And as for the timing, I'm comfortable with the timing as for when it would come back, especially for the new council in 2015. They have the ability to defer if the report that comes back, if there's some additional changes that need to be tweaked. And having that in January will give that flexibility so that it is in time. So, of course, we can be in place for the construction season in April. So I'd be comfortable with the policy coming back in January as well.
Okay, those are the only speakers. Thank you very much for the report. Lively discussion, and we look forward to the next consultation with the public. We'll move on to the second item for this special council meeting, and that is the guidelines for the new large-scale outdoor events. And Mr. Young is here for that. Welcome, Jeff.
Hello. I just want to test this out to make sure.
You're on.
Very good, thank you. So the background today, Special Events has the objective of supporting vitality through special events and festivals throughout the year. In 2013, more than 100 City of Kitchener sponsored events took place throughout the city. That was included over 500,000 attendees that would have enjoyed those festivals last year. The primary venue for these events has typically been downtown Kitchener, but with the increase in events throughout the year, there are limited dates, and with that, event organizers are beginning to look at alternate locations, both public and private, throughout the city. Big Music Fest is the most recent example of this with McLennan Park. On March 31st, a council resolution was requested for the development of guidelines for new large-scale outdoor events at city-owned facilities. Why do we need these event guidelines? We want to give the community confidence that the interests are being considered in the development of these new large-scale events in the city. We have a significant opportunity to expand the brand of Kitchener as an event destination throughout the year. We want to continue to increase the economic impact of special events in our community and distribute those benefits to other city facilities and other areas throughout the city and not just focus solely on the downtown. Some of the risks that come up with any new event would be the community disruption, whether it be noise, traffic, just essentially a new event taking place in a non-traditional venue. The financial implications. Sometimes these events are not budgeted for, but we share some of the responsibility on ensuring that these events are successful and beneficial to the community. And then the uncertainty related to testing new venues. And again, it goes without saying the discussion with Big Music Fest could apply to any new event that we have in the city at a new venue. It just doesn't have the track record in the past of hosting those events. So the current situation is large-scale events, as I noted, typically occur in the downtown. Up until this point, events have evolved organically over a number of years. This has allowed event organizers over that period of time to react to and mitigate concerns of the community. Excuse me. Relationships between event organizers, the City of Kitchener, and local community have also evolved over that annual cycle. A well-established protocol for addressing issues generally minimizes the impact of annual events in the city. Our staff continue to work very closely with internal units and external partners to address potential adverse impacts in the community. And we certainly work with the event organizers before moving forward with an event to ensure they have the core competencies needed to manage the events that they're looking to plan in our city. Some of the challenges of new large-scale events, especially the new ones that come fully formed at a new venue, is that a comprehensive planning process needs to be used to identify and address potential issues in the community. These types of events require an approach to community relations that recognize the potential impact on that community. A set of guidelines to support the event planning and community relations process would be very helpful. The guidelines would provide certainty to event developers and staff as to the process required to successfully implement the event, and they would assure council and the local community that the City of Kitchener and the community's interests are being considered in the process. Some of the objectives of the special events guidelines included in Appendix A recommend the support of development of new events in new outdoor venues across the City of Kitchener. These guidelines are intended for events with an estimated daily attendance of greater than 10,000 people. Currently, when you look at the portfolio of events that we have in the City of Kitchener, it's a small number that would fall into that category. We do have a few. Examples would be the Blues Festival, Rib Fest, Multicultural Festival, Cruising on King. Proposals for new large-scale outdoor events such as the Big Music Fest are expected to be rare and infrequent opportunities for the City of Kitchener to take advantage of. And in addition, staff are creating an event-in-a-box online resource to commute event organizers within our community, whether it's a large-scale event or a small neighborhood association, to put an event on just to give them some guidelines to establish their events. With few exceptions, the recommended guidelines reflected in these guidelines are currently in use by our special events staff throughout the year. Formalizing the guidelines into a council-approved document presents an opportunity for council to discuss and confirm several key elements before the guidelines are finalized for approval. We've identified 3 discussion points in the report to focus on. Certainly more are open to discussion. The first one would be cost estimates for city services. The city's practice is to provide cost estimates in advance to the event organizer for city services required to support their event. Figures are based typically on the event plan and historical experience for a similar event in the city. Following the event, actual costs are billed back to the event organizer. At times, there are challenges throughout the year where the actual costs have come in slightly higher than what the estimates have been provided, and this has an impact on the net bottom line for the event organizer. Some cities do put a cap on the variance between the actual costs of city services and the estimates that are provided. The second point would be consultation with the public. The proposed guidelines for large-scale outdoor events make a clear commitment to inform the community and the public early on in the process, consult with them on any potential issues that need to be addressed, and respond to their concerns and issues that are raised during the event. These provisions should support the development of trust and confidence within the community that their concerns are being taken seriously. It will be important to keep in mind that requirements for community consultation can create delays and additional uncertainty in the process for an event organizer that may have an influence on their choice of location for a large event. It's important to note that the market for large-scale events is very competitive, and the introduction of excessive requirements for public consultation or tight restrictions on the event operation is expected to result in fewer opportunities for the city moving forward. And the final note was public information sessions for established events. Provisions have been included such that public information sessions will not be required if the park or city facility has previously been used for similar events unless there are substantial changes affecting the event. These guidelines do not apply to existing large-scale events such as the ones I had noted earlier. Introducing the requirement to have a public information session for these events could reduce the opportunity for the event to grow and change over time. Consulting with the public on potential issues or concerns and how to address them will potentially have a different outcome than consulting with the public for approval of any proposed change. It will be important to provide clear direction on the application of this provision to established events and the decisions the public is being consulted on within the guidelines for the established events. That concludes the overview, and open for questions.
Councillor Singh.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Jeff, for this report, and to the rest of staff that were involved with this. This couldn't have come sooner, and unfortunately a little later than I would have hoped, especially the fact that Big Music Fest, the contract has already been signed. Some of the requirements in this were absolutely necessary for that contract as well, and I'm trying to see what was captured in that, seeing that this is the right direction for the policy change. On page 1B-6, it talks to cost estimates for city services. I absolutely agree with the direction for full cost recovery, and that's full cost recovery from the promoter, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So as for street sweeping, litter pickup, trash removal, that's not necessarily for the actual venue itself, but also relates to surrounding area if that impact expanded beyond the actual venue location.
Absolutely. What we deem to be the event site, and typically in Victoria Park, that would extend, for instance, if the event is at the clock tower or on the grounds or the commons, onto the island. But then as you start to get further away from the island on the other side of the park, it starts to get a little unclear in terms of what is the actual event site and what is typical trash that may accumulate. As well, we look at it as you go up Gaukel. There is a certain expectation that part of the event will spill over into Gaukel, and yes, absolutely, that's included in
But it
the cost recovery.
puts additional onus on the promoter as well, including parking signs install and removal. Okay, so if you look at it, and you refer to Big Music Fest as an example, and I'm going to carry on with that theme. So Big Music Fest, a lot of these things were required or will be required. Parking signs, install and removal, fire inspections, as well as barricades, cones, fencing, because there will be some street closures related to that, as well as, of course, as you already outlined, the street sweeping, litter pickup, and trash. What component of these outlines and cost estimate recovery did we make it a requirement within the contract with Big Music Fest?
Everything that's applicable in here, which is essentially everything except for electrical power hookup, street banner installation and removal. We're not using a city-owned stage.
Street sweeping and...
We have the litter pickup and trash removal. We don't anticipate the need for street sweeping. It's rare that we require street sweeping for an event just because the amount of trash that finds its way onto the street is...
And parking signs for,
minimal.
of course, we're looking at having parking marshals and entryway to most of the subdivisions there. And I'm guessing that would be a carrying theme for any future events as well. That cost recovery, will there be as well? Or?
Yes, so that's included in the road closure cost. That would come with the road close signs and directional signage and whatnot.
Okay, good. So the other thing it speaks to is the public consultation. And I think that is the most important aspect of a guideline engaging the residents that would be most impacted by any outdoor event on a public facility. So 90 days prior to the first event date, is that perhaps sufficient time in advance to the event? Simply what I'm saying is we don't want to be in a scenario again where everything has already been planned and organized, acts have been signed, contracts are pretty much ready to be signed and prepared, and then we're engaging the public. Well, what do you have your say in this? Are we taking that into consideration, that it needs to be prior to that process?
The guidelines as they're set forth right now would be similar to how it would be managed for a larger scale event. And I'll use the Blues Festival, for example. They looked to, a few years back, layer in an additional stage in Victoria Park. We worked with the ward councillors in addition to the Victoria Park Working Group to make them aware of the plan changes that we're looking for, and it provided them an opportunity to provide their feedback and suggestions, and that has worked well over the past several years in terms of the plans for year one, say. And then following that year, that's where the post-event evaluation and discussion with the neighborhood association really comes in. Because over the last couple of years, whether it be Blues Fest or Rib Fest in McLennan Park, Victoria Park, we've been able to use that feedback to continue to shape the event and continue to utilize the feedback from the neighborhood associations to ensure that they're being heard and those concerns are being addressed year over year.
Well, when it's reoccurring, it's always easier. Of course, the hard lessons are already learned at that point. It's more of a continuation of that process. I'm speaking to the first year events typically. And that's why I want to make sure that the caution is given as part of this report, that be, the public consultation process be, before we give indication to the promoter, yes, we agree, yes, you can proceed, prior to that public engagement and process. So if issues do arise and there is overwhelming reluctance or undesire for that community to absorb that type of event or add feedback, that most of planning not be in advance to that point where that we're taking in feedback but not be able to do anything with it. So I just want to make sure that 90 days is sufficient to that.
Mr. Wilmer?
So I think we need to be perfectly clear on this point. We're being consistent with the direction given by Council when it passed its resolution back in March, which was we deal with public information sessions for informing residents. So it's not our intent that we would consult with the community for new festivals, but we would inform the community. So there's a clear distinction there. I hope that's clear to Council.
I think it's clear to me, and in many cases, when you inform the public, in sense, input starts receiving automatically through, of course, their representatives in their ward as well as engagement staff. So that can be left into the public realm for them to be appropriately take that on their own part. But that information be made aware. And that still be well in advance prior to any completion of event planning details. So making sure that 90 days is sufficient for that time period. One last quick question. So the recommendation on the table, would they need to be moved, or they are part of the onus of the resolution that was already passed prior but then deferred for the report to come back at a later time? So does there need to be an adoption of these guidelines, or is that automatic from the previous motion?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
The guidelines that are on this report,
Yeah.
do they need to be adopted by council? Do they need to be endorsed or moved by council, or they are automatic of the last motion?
It's a good question, and Mr. Chapman, because I'm not sure what the resolution said before. So, Mr. Chapman.
Through the chair, it's a procedural question. Yes, the intention is that they be adopted by a council motion. They're not here today because typically at strategic sessions, council doesn't pass motions, but I believe June 30th is the date that they will come back for final.
That's all I wanted to confirm. Okay.
So it will come back with a recommendation
Great.
for June 30.
Perfect.
Okay, Councillor Etherington.
Through you, Mr. Chair, to Jeff, page 1B3, the part that says council was vague on establishing this section, public information sessions for established events. I thought we were quite clear on that, and my understanding of it takes a different direction than what is in this paragraph. What we seem to be saying to people with established events is, sure, we can talk to you, but it's already decided, so you won't have any chance to change that decision. It's when I read statements like introducing the requirement to have a public information session for these events could reduce the opportunity for them to grow and change over time. That's fine, I agree with that. It certainly could. But to me, it's the people affected by those events that should come first. And if the Blues Festival or any of those established events change their hours of people nearby on Richmond, Water, David, being bombarded with that level of noise. If they change that from, as they did, from, let's say, for the sake of argument, 4 hours to 8 hours, I think there should be a public information session. That has a direct impact on them. And I don't think it should just involve meeting with the ward councillor or even the neighbourhood group. I think you should hold a public information session for the people impacted and get their agreement or buy-in to that change. That's not what this says. There's a lot of waffle in this section, and that makes me uncomfortable.
I'm not sure that it's waffling. I grant that you don't agree with what it is, but I don't think the phrase is waffling. If you want to come back in, go ahead, Mr. Councillor Etherington.
Well, I say waffling when it presents the picture that it is unclear if it was the intention of council for this requirement to apply to events that have already been established. I remember that I thought I was quite clear on that. I don't think there should, when there is such a change made to an established event, I think we owe it to the people affected to have an upfront information session where we let them know that. Well, not that the waffle to me is not saying that.
Mr. Wilmer.
I would suggest then that when the policy is adopted by council at the end of this month, that it be quite clear as to what constitutes a minor change that doesn't need this kind of public information session and what's a more substantial change that does trigger that, so that it's not left to chance or is left unclear. I think what's meant at the bottom of page B3 is if there's an established festival, that festival operator needs to have a little bit of flexibility to make some minor adjustments without having to go and ask the community. But we're in council's hands really as to what constitutes that minor flexibility and what's a major change that would trigger the policy.
And I agree on that, Mr. Wilmer, but I don't think it's a minor change to double the time of an event. But I agree with you. That would be, it would be better to see more clarity in that section.
Mr. Bowman.
Thank you. At the top of page 1B9 then is where the policy addresses that now. So the public information session will not be required if the park or city facility has previously been used for a similar event, unless at the discretion of the ward councillor there are substantial changes affecting the planned duration, location, or noise level. So that's intended to provide clarity, but we're in council's hands again as to if you want to put more parameters in there or make it more clear, we're open to that.
That is a fail-safe measure there with the ward councillor, so it probably is okay because it would, a substantive change may be doubling, but we can talk about what the potential wording would be at the June 30th meeting then. If that might be something, Councillor, if you still feel strongly about it after reading that again, coming back with an amendment to the resolution on June the 30th would be appropriate. Because we don't have that in front of us at this point in time anyway.
Okay, I appreciate it.
Councillor Galloway-Sealock.
Yeah, I just have a comment. Is it time now
for
comments? Okay. Just quickly, I wanted to say that I think these are good guidelines and good report, and is a good report, and it's something that we can continue to build on. I think it's important that we remind ourselves that the intent of special events is to increase urban vitality. And you have to believe that in order for these principles to be put in place. And therefore, the difference between inform versus consult is a very important point. That it's been clear that we're going to look to inform the public and not consult them. So that would mean that they can provide feedback, but at the end of the day, it's going to be the discretion of city staff in order to move forward with the events. I think it's also great to hear that staff are willing to listen to feedback from the community before events, during events, and after events in order to continue to enhance the experience of our urban vitality within the city of Kitchener.
Councillor Singh.
Yeah, just coming back to one last comment, and I agree with what was said lastly through Councillor Galloway-Sealock that, of course, the essence of this is to increase, as she said it, urban vitality, and we are not achieving that if it's on undue disturbance to an effective neighborhood as well. And that's why I think as part of the public information that will start the process of engagement as well on taking feedback. And that's why I think whatever comes back for the 30th, and we may have to tweak it on that day as well, that response, that feedback that does come in through engagement with the public, that be as part of a determination if that area is appropriate and suitable for that type of an event. And that's why we not be preemptive in planning and too far ahead of ourselves and ensure that concerns be taken well in advance. And last point would be to, the report talks about if an event is already established. And the way I see it, an event happening for the first year is not considered established. So tremendous effort needs to be made the first year prior to the event happening, and that same effort needs to be made thereafter as a reflecting on the processes that were put in, how it was managed, and how it was taken by the public as well. And that itself should be the determining factor if that event is suitable and necessary for that neighborhood. Again, we don't want to be doing it at the cost of tremendous disturbance and undue pressure to neighborhoods that may not have the sustainability for large events like this. And this is why it's factored, the policy guidelines are factored towards large events. Because smaller events can happen anywhere. It's easy to accomplish and accommodate. It's when you have an inflow of tremendous amount of event goers that can be a considerable pressure to a neighborhood. So I would hope that the report, whatever comes back the 30th, takes into account of a proper consultation with the neighborhood after an event takes place so that determination can be made if that event is suitable for that actual neighborhood proceeding further. Because it's not to say that the city or this corporation is against that event happening. A determination that needs to be made is that site appropriate for that event after it has occurred.
Councillor Fernandez.
Thank you, and I apologize for missing some of the discussion. So I really just want to speak very briefly to the impact on the public on a new and large event. And of course, when you speak to the public on anything like this, it's really going to be subjective, because some people will say, let's go, it's amazing, it's wonderful. Other people will find it very difficult to tolerate the substantial change that may befall their neighborhood. So I think we've covered off. I've looked a couple of times back and forward through the guidelines and highlighted things that I really liked. So I liked that we had timelines. I like that we had the ability to include a number of different departments, including outside departments, so Waterloo Regional Police and EMS and things like that. I think all of those are crucial. I'll be interested to see the report when it comes back, but if it includes everything that's been put in here, I feel right at this moment that we're covering off an awful lot of areas of concern that have been expressed before. I'll be really interested to see the public input and engagement after this event in July and see what happens. So thank you.
Councillor Ioannidis.
First of all, I just want to thank Jeff for all the great work he's done with Big Music Fest. I wasn't here last week, and I didn't get a chance to say thanks, because I think, Jeff, you've done a tremendous job, and you've been under a lot of pressure, and I think you handled yourself very well, and I think you've done the city proud, so I want to say thank you for that. As for this report, I think what you've brought here before us, I think it's a good point, good starting point. And I don't think we should go any further than that, because I think if we start putting in any further restrictions, we are seriously going to really hamper attracting any type of big event coming to Kitchener. And I think we all can agree, we all want to have big events in Kitchener. We all want to make Kitchener a vibrant place to be. So I think this is a starting point. I don't think we need to go to the far ends of the earth to make it really stringent. I think this is the way we need to be and start off with. And I think Big Music Fest was a great example of what we could learn. We learned that, at first, there was a big outcry about, we don't want this event in our park. Well, ticket sales certainly have shown that over 13% of that neighborhood wants the park. And once we had that public consultation or information session, they were very comfortable with what was being put before them. So I think those steps are in there. I'm glad it's marked, like as Councillor Fernandez said. So I think we learned a lot, and let's move forward with this. I think this is a great start.
Councillor Etherington.
I just wanted to say quickly, Mr. Mayor, that I appreciate the comment on page 1B9. That answers my concerns. And I apologize for the use of the word waffle. It's perfectly clear on 1B9. I just read right over it. Thank you.
Okay. Those are the only comments. So it was here for discussion, and a resolution, or recommendation rather, will come forward on June the 30th directly to council meeting to approve the guidelines. Okay. We have one more item for the special council meeting, and that is to authorize the in-camera session. Moved by Councillor Galway-Seelock, seconded by Councillor Glenn Graham. Those in favour? Opposed? That's carried. This meeting is adjourned. Yes, I think we did, but we had to get